Okay, so thanks very much, and welcome everybody to the third webinar. Just a little bit about what Nature Returns is, and still is for this year. It used to be called Nature-Based Solutions for Climate Change at the Landscape Scale, which was a bit of a mouthful, which we very quickly changed to Nature Returns to give some idea of what we were trying to achieve. It's a pilot programme combining science, land management, finance, and researching carbon and biodiversity where there were gaps in our knowledge, looking at the wider benefits to people, and as this webinar will cover, the practicalities of green finance. We've been developing and testing tools, and a lot of, or if not all of this information is available on the Q website, their sub-website, Nature Returns. So, again, just to say briefly, if you weren't at the last few webinars, what each program was doing. Workstream 1 was looking at program management and actual site establishment, habitat establishment, and led by Natural England and local partners. Workstream 2 was looking at cross-habitat and cross-site comparison of carbon and biodiversity, looking at those habitats that we were helping to create in Workstream 1 and comparing and contrasting them to other known habitats across the country. Workstream 3 was looking at carbon science and was led by Q, their Wakehurst Living Laboratory, and that was looking at getting more science around carbon sequestration, in particular looking at laser photography of trees in particular, which was really superb. And our workstream here, Workstream 4, looking at governance models for blended finance solutions at a landscape scale. It's been a privilege to work with Melissa and Emma on this programme. But before we start, what do we mean when we say green finance? You may also have heard the term nature funding or blended funding. Green finance is a generic term used to describe investments into projects delivering clean, environmentally sustainable and resilient growth. The previous government published a green finance strategy, which is reflected in this slide. But let's start by saying there are a lot of terms used, such as green finance, nature markets, blended funding. In this talk, we're largely talking about blended funding. And by that we mean accessing other funding sources besides government grant funding. And that may be through the sale of ecosystem services, such as woodland carbon code credits, or via philanthropic and corporate social government giving by companies, or by companies wanting to buy specific outcomes such as flood risk reduction, water quality, or carbon offsetting. Within deaf or arm's length bodies, our focus is on financing green. This is our opportunity to attract other monies for ours and our partners' projects, and we work with partners to help the environmental improvement projects. So we're looking at carbon sequestration, water quality improvements, flood risk reduction, those kind of outputs. And that's with a specific aim of looking at private sources of funding, which might help to finance those, with a goal of reducing the reliance on government funding, because we need to develop more regenerative economic models of operation. On that note, I'm going to hand over now to Melissa. Hopefully she'll be able to take control of the webinar. She has. Fantastic.
Yep. There we go.
And I'll leave it to you.
Thank you very much, Chris. So hi, everyone. I'm Melissa Swartz from the Environment Agency's Future Funding team, and I've been working with Chris and Emma and the wider program team on this. So in developing this work stream, we were interested in understanding the elements needed for catchment or landscape scale blended funding, right? So how do we do this at scale? And how do we make it replicable? What are the key ingredients with regards to partnership working, governance structures, credit use, decision making, and just general approaches to finding other sources of funding besides government funding? As our Nature Returns program unfolded, our approach was a mix of commissioned research and working with our program partners as they considered how they would engage with blended funding. And the map that was on the previous slide, or 2 slides back, showed the distribution of those. And you'll have heard about those in webinar 1, which I think Moira will post at some point. That webinar is on the YouTube channel. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we've worked with partners, and then Emma from Forestry Commission will talk about some of their commissioned research, and then she'll hand back to me, and I'll mention some of the research that the EA commissioned, and then we'll wrap up and with some final thoughts and take some questions. So as part of our work stream, we worked with 3 of the Nature Returns local project partners, which are highlighted on the slide, to understand how we can develop collaborative strategic funding plans for the catchment or landscape where they're operating. And we wanted to do this because we really need action at scale. By focusing on the environmental outcomes needed and thinking about the funding for delivering those outcomes at the strategic or almost like at a programmatic level, our idea was that we could build an overall plan that provides better bargaining power when approaching potential buyers or investors, and with lower transaction costs. So landscape or catchment scale initiatives provide a solid framework for investment by putting in place governance structures and supporting businesses and landowners to develop kind of more investment ready projects. So in addition to the ecosystem service benefits that the nature-based solutions delivery would provide when you're looking at it from the money point of view, working at a larger scale with multiple people and organizations can help with that collaborative approach to increase your bargaining power, right? Drive a harder negotiation. Our idea was that by taking the strategic view of the actions needed to solve the environmental problems in a landscape or catchment, and by planning for the funding element up front rather than leaving it to kind of the end of all the planning, we could develop a strategic action and funding it, so strategic action plans, but also funding and investment plans for the catchment. So not for any one organization, but for the catchment. And in doing so, that would help generate a more coordinated effort in the approach to finding either grant funding or approaching potential buyers. Because let's be honest, we need a mix of both grant and private funding. And the basic steps of the approach that we were working on with these 3 catchment partners or local project partners is outlined on this side. So starting with your overall problem statement, we started out thinking about vision and realized that that's useful to have, but actually recognizing kind of the crux of the problem that you're trying to solve in your catchment is really helps focus people and helps understand where the objectives overline. Thinking about where you are now in terms of solving that problem and how you need, what actions you need to get there, what resources you need to get there, who are the potential funding sources, so what grants are available, but also who are the businesses that are buying products from that catchment, who operate in that catchment, who might be interested in making that catchment or that landscape more resilient. Who's driving that engagement? Who in your partnership already has engagement with some of those people? How do you build on that? How do you do that collaboratively? What timescales are you looking at? And how are you going to measure success? So the key is that the creation of that type of a plan should enable the identification of different funding sources for the identified economic and environmental opportunities to transition land to nature-based solutions that could be delivered. So it's really about mapping out the data and evidence needs, identifying the actions needed, and recognizing how catchment partners can better work together to share skills. And it's not meant to be a delivery plan as such, but kind of a higher level, more programmatic document or strategy document to help develop that delivery plan. It should link to a delivery plan. But by putting the funding and investment thinking at the front end of that program planning could help better identify opportunities. So in order to test this, we co-facilitated some workshops with Eunomia Research and Consulting with the 3 local partnerships to stimulate discussion and agreement around this idea. These workshops included landscape and catchment partners. They were all in person, and they focused on developing the big idea, kind of identifying what people have to offer and what they're trying to achieve for their places. We explored the partnership's understanding of ecosystem markets and buyers of ecosystem services and with their ability to engage with them. And we provided some overview information of green finance and successful market structures. In all of the workshops, a potential lead organization was identified, and especially for the Derwent Living Forest workshop, an initial action plan was created. For the others, more complementary opportunities were identified. For example, in the Wansbeck in Northumberland, Northumberland County Council, who were participating in the local investment and natural capital program, made £100,000 available to support development of this catchment scale pipeline of investment, which is fantastic. So overall, the workshops were a success and have kickstarted action. So I have not delved into the 3 specific partners that we worked with, partly because that is covered in webinar 1 that will be on the YouTube channel. So I am assuming a certain level of understanding here, but that's okay. But overall, participants valued the opportunity to work together and to have the headspace to work strategically and think strategically together and to have that be facilitated. They really appreciated having that time to come together and talk. And there was generally a good appetite from attendees to take the discussions forward. Time is definitely needed to move each group towards that collaborative development of a strategic partnership, or that strategic planning level. And keeping momentum and support relies on a strong convener, right? A facilitator who can help drive that forward. The confidence and ability to convene or lead partnerships. Attendees were concerned about who had the time to do this, the funding to do it, and the remit to convene and lead strategic partnership at the landscape scale, as opposed to thinking about it in a more delivery focused way. But Nature Returns has contributed to building those strategic partnerships. That's not to say that further work isn't needed, right? I think everybody who's worked with catchment or landscape partners knows that the resource, both funding-wise and time-wise and staff-wise, needed to facilitate those more strategic conversations is needed. And the other thing we found too is that the big idea really needs to work for everybody. More time could be given to visioning with a chance for more voices to input. We started the groups on a process, but all of this is iterative and will take time. And all of the groups have built on where they started and are taking it forward. And just the last point on the workshops, there were different levels of knowledge and comfort around nature markets and green finance. A general need emerged for support and some training around kind of getting everybody to the same level of understanding around nature markets. And I think that's partly because it is such a fast moving space, right? There's a lot of change happening. So just summary of some initial lessons learned from these workshops. People are definitely up for the challenge. There's a lot of people out there already doing some amazing work and trying to make this happen. We are just one program, the Nature Returns program. We did also work across and talk to some of the landscape recovery people who are doing amazing things. And obviously there's the Natural Environment Investment Readiness Fund program, which has helped over 80 projects become business ready. So there's a lot happening in the nature market or green finance space. However, one of the things that we will say is that this takes time. Do not underestimate the number of meetings needed. And recognize the value of a well-facilitated meeting. It also, I think one of the things that's not written down on the slide, but that we really learned was not everybody's comfortable with the level of risk. So this is risky, it is new, it is innovative, and it takes a certain willingness to kind of suck it and see, right? See what happens when you start trying something different and something new. You're not going to have all the answers when you start trying to do green finance. You just need to see what happens and see where it evolves and goes to. And that isn't comfortable for everybody. And one final slide from me before I hand over to Emma. after delivering those workshops, we then realized that it could potentially be useful to provide some further support to project partners and others starting on their catchment or landscape scale blended funding journey. We started putting together a learning series. So the series is based on recorded panel discussion webinars with those who are successfully blending funding on the topics on the slide. And we're packaging these up as group learning exercises with associated discussion notes and activities that will help embed the learning from the panel discussions, just to help participants make the most of listening to a webinar discussion. And we expect this to be available in late spring, early summer this year. So we're just trying to wrap things up and find a place to host it. So I think that's everything from me. Emma, over to yourself.
Thanks, Melissa. So hi everyone, my name's Emma Stewart and I work at the Forestry Commission in our climate change team. And I have been project managing our work in the Nature Returns programme for the last few years. And so today I just want to share some of the highlights really of what we've been doing and some of our reflections from working in this space over that time. So as Melissa's already discussed, a large part of our focus in Workstream 4 has been working with the programme's local partners to really figure out how to do blended finance on the ground. So much of the work that we've been doing has been focused on the supply side. So really delivering nature recovery and ecosystem services through leveraging private funding sources. But we can't really just look at the supply side in a silo without understanding more about the demand side. So by the demand, I really just mean private sources of funding, private actors, which will put money into nature projects by whichever means that may be, whether that's buying nature credits like carbon or kind of just supporting a project more holistically and wanting to realise the benefits from it. So I'll talk about some of the research projects that we've done as the Forestry Commission that have looked more at the demand side. So helping us and helping the local partners to understand the market better. And really we've focused on voluntary markets in our research. Obviously because it's kind of what we're working with right now. So yes, we have a voluntary carbon market and compliance markets for neutrality, biodiversity, net gain. But the scope of voluntary markets we kind of feel is where the biggest opportunities lie at the moment. So our research has been focused there. And just because compliance markets are a bit limited in their potential because they serve very specific requirements. So I'll talk a bit about the demand research projects that we've been doing, and I'll just touch on how we've been working to support emerging codes and standards to just help us understand how markets might develop and where future opportunities might be to leverage more private finance. So the first project I'll talk about is one of the earliest projects we did in the programme. So we commissioned some research into prices paid for carbon units validated to the Woodland Carbon Code and Peatland Code. And this is some work that the Forestry Commission has wanted to do for a really long time, to be honest, because we've never had concrete data about it before. The only information that we ever had about pricing was anecdotal, and that's just because the trades that are made through the Woodland Carbon Code and the Peatland Code are all commercially sensitive. So we are not cited on any of them. So it's been over 10 years since the Woodland Carbon Code launched, but this is the first time we've actually been able to get hold of this information. So this has been really valuable to us and to the sector. So to those people, they're actually making decisions on whether they should enter their woodlands into the Woodland Carbon Code or not. And just quickly, for those that aren't familiar, the Woodland Carbon Code allows for the sale of carbon credits from woodland creation. So carbon credits are bought by companies, businesses who are looking to achieve net zero targets. And similarly, the Peatland Code allows for carbon credit sales from peatland restoration. So I mentioned that these trades are all commercially sensitive. So really we needed a way to allow people to anonymously report their pricing data. So we worked with a US-based organization called Ecosystem Marketplace that collects pricing data from carbon markets around the world. And a large part of the work they did was essentially just stakeholder engagement to encourage market participants within the Woodland Carbon Code and peatland Code to disclose their data to Ecosystem Marketplace's online hub. And that allowed them to aggregate the data and give us these figures here. So you can see that we have a number of years worth of data, so from 2020 to 2023. And really the main thing that we want you to look at here is the middle row. So that shows the prices rising by about £4 per unit, a unit being equivalent to 1 tonne of carbon dioxide. So effectively, in the last 4 years, the price of carbon credits has doubled. So these data only represent transactions that have been disclosed to the hub. So it doesn't represent 100% of all transactions made, but it does give us really useful information as to what is actually happening out there. So also want to just kind of draw your attention to the spread price of the bottom row, the difference between the highest and the lowest prices collected. So you can see in 2020, someone was paying over £130 per unit, which is a very high amount. We would love to see carbon credits traded for that much, but that's really just an outlier, and we've seen that kind of go down over the coming years to a much smaller range. But really what that represents is just the huge range of prices that and the results of negotiations really for different carbon credits from different types of woodland creation projects. So woodland creation projects, depending on how they're designed, will deliver more wider benefits. So for biodiversity, for water quality, potentially for flooding, and buyers might value those things differently. So they might be prepared to pay a higher price for credits from projects that deliver on those things. So this has been a really valuable piece of work from the forestry industry, and we're really pleased to see that the work that we started through Nature Returns is actually being continued by Scottish Forestry, who are funding more data collection, which they did last year, and they're doing the same this year as well. So the second project that I want to talk about was a pretty important one for us. We decided to explore more of the demand for green finance projects generally. And we worked with Eunomia again to do this, looking into voluntary markets. So why might private companies want to pay nature projects to deliver ecosystem services? So Eunomia conducted interviews with a number of private companies who have an interest in this space. So they worked with some supermarkets and manufacturers, finance institutions, and some others. And really, we just wanted to understand the potential for emerging nature markets. So we already know a lot about the voluntary carbon market, but what about nature markets for other ecosystem services? So like water quality or biodiversity. Is anyone interested in buying those sorts of things? You know, what's happening now? So really we wanted to do this to help our local partners understand how to place themselves in the market, but also just to find out more about where sources of private funding might be coming from. Can it live up to the hype around green finance, essentially, is what we wanted to know more about. So we focused on the voluntary side because, as I said before, it's kind of what we're currently working with. So yes, BNG and nutrient neutrality are already up and running, but they're compliance markets, they're not voluntary markets. So they only really apply in certain situations. But voluntary markets could be adopted much more widely and open to more businesses. So before I go into what we found out through this project, I'll just kind of preface it by saying that we don't think the demand is really there yet. And to create high integrity green finance world, a lot of work needs to be done to make sure that when we finance green, we do it properly. So whilst the kind of focus of developing green finance is currently more on the supply side, there is a huge amount of work that needs to be done to stimulate the demand side of the market as well. So what this piece of work showed was that without clear reason to do so, businesses are not acting on nature through green finance currently, not anywhere near the scale we want them to be anyway. Carbon is the only voluntary nature market that can really represent any value for businesses currently. And really that's just because we are working within a much more clear framework for carbon. We have a national net zero target for 2050, and we have environmental reporting guidelines that inform businesses how to report against carbon claims. And businesses understand the benefit to engaging with this market. So by buying carbon credits to help them reach their net zero goals, it is something that customers and investors are increasingly interested in. So it can set a business apart in the market if they engage in carbon. But for other benefits from nature, so like water quality, like natural flood management or biodiversity, we just don't have the same frameworks that give businesses confidence that these are a good thing to put their money into. So there are very few examples of businesses supporting these sorts of activities. There are examples here and there, but it's not. We're not at the stage yet where there's kind of that consistent demand. We've got examples of businesses giving philanthropically, but if we want to leverage significantly more private sources of funding, we need that consistent demand. It also showed that stronger policy and regulation is needed to leverage greater amounts of money from private sources. And businesses just aren't confident yet where to put their money, as policy just isn't clear enough in the long term about where the focus should be. That and the fact that nature projects are very long term themselves, and businesses need to know that there is long term policy like net zero, which is supportive of their actions. So whilst we're seeing these developments in the supply side with codes and standards and the BSI standard development for nature markets, and numerous DEFRA and DESNES consultations on things like regulatory requirements and nature market integrity, still not clear how the demand will be stimulated. So thirdly, the fact that nature projects are so long-term makes it difficult for businesses to support them. These projects can take decades to reap the benefits that they promise, but businesses work in much more short-term funding cycles. And we need to find ways to make it make sense for businesses to be able to fund nature projects in the long term. Companies want to know what is being delivered for their money, i.e. the quantification of benefits, which is currently very difficult outside of carbon, largely because there aren't really any operational codes or standards yet to quantify those water or biodiversity benefits in the voluntary markets. Then there's also the spatial element. So that's much more important for some ecosystem services compared to others. So whilst carbon, a ton of carbon dioxide equivalent is the same the world over, for biodiversity or any social water benefits that are coming out of nature projects, they're much more location dependent. So whoever wants to buy that benefit wants to be a beneficiary of it as well. So a business based in Cornwall, for example, is unlikely to be interested in paying for water quality benefits in Northumberland, where that might not benefit their business. And so that reduces the size of the market for non-carbon ecosystem services, and can mean significant competition for a small number of buyers. And some of our conversations with the local partners have shown that where they are trying to work with buyers or actors with private sources of funding, there's competition for that, for the limited number of beneficiaries for what they're trying to deliver. And not forgetting really that in uncertain economic times, doing the right thing, which the research showed that a lot of companies want to do the right thing, but doing the right thing doesn't necessarily factor at the top of their priorities in a stagnating economy. So this research showed that operating in a voluntary environment will always be subject to wider economic performance. And then lastly on this topic, there is a skills shortage in this area. So even from the demand side, companies are going to need expertise in ecology, environment, legal expertise, financial expertise, contract negotiations, etc., so they can make sure that what they're buying into is delivering what they actually want out of it. So it will take time for businesses to be in positions where they can begin to take these long-term actions, and they just need to be sure that it's right for their business as well. But yeah, so this was just like a small piece of work really, with a small number of market participants. So we would love to be able to carry out a bit more market research at a larger scale. But what it does show for now is that without clear signals from government that it's something they should pursue, business is not ready to take green finance to the level that we would like to see it at. And then finally, just to talk about the work we've done with emerging codes and standards, and supporting them where we can and making links with local partners. So we approached the Agroforestry Carbon Code, which estimates future carbon sequestration of in-field trees, and wilder carbon, which estimates future carbon sequestration of a number of different types of natural habitat. And since our local partners were carrying out different types of habitat restoration, we offered them the opportunity to have a carbon estimate run using these two codes, where it was applicable to the work they were doing. And it just enabled these codes to ground truth the methodologies on real sites and support them through their development. So as it stands, the Agroforestry Carbon Code isn't seen to be viable as a standalone code, because the carbon sequestration and the number of credits raised just isn't enough to cover the costs of validation and ongoing verification. But in future, the methodology could be used for another code, such as the whole farm carbon code. Wilder carbon is much further along in its journey, and it has already launched actually with a small number of projects up and running, and with some buyers identified. And the third code that we have supported, and that we've been working much more closely with, is the Woodland Water Code, and that's being developed by Forest Research, and it's looking to quantify the water benefits of woodland creation across 3 different metrics. So looking at water quality, water cooling, and flood alleviation. We were able to bring some of this work forward through supporting it through the programme. Really just looking to try and find sites to test the code's methodologies, and just bringing it that much closer to being operational. We also worked with the James Hutton Institute who we brought in to do some more complex modelling using FarmScoper to address, to look at how to best place trees on farms, not farms on trees, best place trees on farms to manage runoff from agricultural operations. And that's it from me. So I'll pass back to Melissa.
Thank you, Emma. So just very quickly to run through some of the research that the Environment Agency commissioned as part of this program. You can see here a short summary of some of the reports. They're all available at the link that is in the Q&A on our micro website, which is on Q's larger website. So we have commissioned a number of research reports. They're also available on the Natural England Nature Returns Access to Evidence page. So I'm not going to talk about every single one of these. However, I would like to highlight 2, the Governance of Blended Funding, the Governance Blended Finance report and the Aggregation of Ecosystem Suppliers reports. So for the Governance Blended Finance report, the main findings are summarized here on the slide, but I really think that the main message is that there's a lot of talk about KICs or community interest companies. They're having quite a moment, and a lot of partnerships feel they need to rush to set one up. But what I would say is hang fire. The main thing to do first is understand why you're doing it. What do you need? So form follows function. Thinking about what you're trying to do, why that governance or legal structure, what are you hoping that it will do for you? So the structure or legal structure itself doesn't bring in funding from other sources. It's just a vehicle, a legal vehicle to manage the money and risks and other things, but focusing on the problem you're trying to solve and how the catchment partners can work together to do that first, and then worrying about whether a legal structure is required to facilitate that is really important. And this report kind of talks through that. It talks about the pros and cons of the different legal structures that are available, that are being used, their ease of setting up. It's a really there's a really straightforward and useful table in there, which I did not try to replicate on the slide because it would be impossible to read, but it is there on the report. The report sits on the Green Finance Institute's Hive website on the Investment Readiness Toolkit under Section 6, but if you go to the link that was put in the chat, you will be able to find that at all as well. And the other thing to say about these governance structures is that there is no one size fits all. There is no off-the-shelf model that can be replicated at this point. Everything is, I mean, you can replicate elements of it, but everything is bespoke. We do not have enough blended funding examples going on yet that to make them all replicable, to have all the quirks figured out, to be able to say, right, here's one, just do this, and then you're on your way. That's not how it works. This is still, well, not how it works yet anyway. It is still very much an evolving space, and partnerships that are working in this way and organizations working in this way are very much having to navigate questions about it for themselves. Having that legal advisor, having a solicitor help them, or a business advisor is really can really help facilitate those conversations. So on the aggregation of ecosystem suppliers report, so this report focuses on different models that are being used currently to aggregate the supply of ecosystem services, so landowners, land managers at the landscape scale, and how those models fit with the different governance structures, and how risks, liabilities, and equity can be managed between the different actors in that system. And I'm highlighting it because it just holds a vast wealth of information, not just on the different ways people have aggregated land, like suppliers of ecosystem services, which are listed there on the slide, and other aggregation models may be available. But they've also, let me just switch slides here. They provide a table, which again, I know the table is quite unreadable, but it looks at those different aggregation models that are being used around the country, and they assess them against the level of complexity for setup, the ease and cost of setup, the ability to deliver maximum environmental outcomes, decision-making risks, all those things. It's just a fab report with a load of information in. So I really just wanted to highlight that here. So like I said, all of those reports that Emma's talked about and that I've talked about are available on the Access to Evidence page or on the Q microsite for Nature Returns, which is linked to in the chat. And I think really just final thoughts from us. We really need to see investment in the environment linked to the growth agenda. Nature finance, green finance, whatever you want to call it, is not a separate type of finance. It has to be seen as an integral part of our economy. We need businesses to recognize that investing in the environment makes their businesses more, not just sustainable, but more resilient to the climate shocks that we are going to be facing, and that it will keep their businesses operating into the future. And that means not just their profit-making ability, but the health and well-being of their employees and of their customers and of their supply chains. And I think Emma pointed to the fact that the demand isn't really there. Businesses aren't really seeing the need to buy these ecosystem services or to invest in this. And I think we all need to do a little bit better at making that clear. And we need government's help in making that point as well. Emma or Chris, I don't know if you want to come in with some final thoughts.
I think, Melissa, that's been fabulous to listen to. I think I'd add two words to the top of that slide, and it's "it takes," because it takes time to scale up. We do need people to scale up, but you need to remember it takes time to scale up.
Yeah, I'd echo that as well, Chris. It takes time to scale up, which is why we need to do it now. There isn't going to be much time left to start doing this sort of thing. If our nature is depleted as it is and the climate changes, so quickly that we're beyond, we get too far. So it takes time, but that time is now.
Yeah,
Excellent.
and that adaptation of business, excuse me, itchy eyes. That adaptation of business, it's the landowner's business as well that needs to adapt in order to survive, not just the business that's buying the ecosystem services. So I think we need to have that in mind as well when we're talking about doing why you do this or why you'd want to do it.
Absolutely. Right. So on that, thank you very much for your time and attention.